Kitchen staff dismissed me during the cooking competition. They didn't know I was the Michelin inspector they were trying to impress. The head chef grabbed my wrist when I reached for the saffron. His name was Dominic Laurier, and he'd been running the kitchen at Étoile Noire for 3 years. He twisted my arm backward until I gasped and told me that precious ingredients weren't for volunteers to touch. I was dressed in the standard white coat they'd given all competition assistants, my hair tucked under a cap, wearing glasses I didn't normally need. Nobody recognized me as Isabelle Moreau, the youngest Michelin inspector in the organization's history. I'd been evaluating restaurants across North America for 7 years, and Étoile Noire had requested their 3rd star. The competition they were hosting was supposed to showcase their capabilities and team excellence. Instead, Dominic was showing me exactly how he treated people he considered beneath him. His sous chef Vincent laughed when I winced from the grip. He asked Dominic why they even let women volunteer in professional kitchens when we just got in the way. I pulled my hand back and apologized quietly, playing the role perfectly. Dominic dismissed me to prep station duty, the lowest position in the kitchen, where I'd be peeling vegetables for the next 6 hours. He told Vincent that volunteers needed to learn their place before touching anything that mattered. I walked to the prep station and started working on the carrots they'd assigned me. The cooking competition had attracted 20 elite chefs from restaurants across 3 states. Each team had brought their sous chefs and line cooks, turning Étoile Noire's massive kitchen into controlled chaos. The prize was $50,000 and feature coverage in Culinary Excellence magazine. But everyone really wanted to impress the Michelin representatives they believed would be arriving for the final judging. Nobody suspected that one was already here, watching everything unfold from the prep station corner where they'd exiled me. Dominic's pastry chef Marguerite walked past and knocked my cutting board onto the floor. The carrots I'd spent 30 minutes preparing scattered across the tile. She didn't apologize, just told me to clean up my mess before someone slipped. Vincent laughed again from across the kitchen and said something to Dominic I couldn't hear. Dominic glanced at me and smirked. I bent down to gather the carrots, memorizing every detail of their behavior. The Michelin evaluation wasn't just about food quality. It assessed the entire restaurant operation, including leadership, team dynamics, and kitchen culture. Dominic was destroying his chances for that 3rd star with every dismissive gesture. He just didn't know it yet because he assumed he was performing for judges who hadn't arrived. The competition's first round required each team to prepare a signature dish using mystery basket ingredients. Dominic's team drew duck breast, blood oranges, fennel, and black garlic. I watched from my corner as he directed his staff with military precision. His technical skills were undeniably excellent. He broke down the duck with expert knife work and built a sauce that incorporated the blood orange and black garlic into something that smelled extraordinary even from 20 feet away. Vincent handled the fennel, creating a quick pickle that would cut through the duck's richness. Marguerite prepared a blood orange reduction for plating. The teamwork appeared flawless if you didn't know what to look for. But I'd spent 7 years learning to see beneath surface excellence. I noticed how Dominic spoke to his female line cook, a young woman named Sophie who handled the garnishes. He told her 3 times that her work was inadequate, redoing her plating arrangements himself while she stood aside looking defeated. When Sophie tried to suggest an adjustment to the fennel preparation, Dominic cut her off mid-sentence and told her to focus on tasks appropriate to her skill level. The head judge for this round was acclaimed chef Raymond Fontaine, who had no idea his evaluation mattered significantly less than mine. Raymond tasted each team's duck preparation and praised Dominic's technical execution. Dominic accepted the compliment and mentioned loudly that Étoile Noire would soon be receiving Michelin recognition for this level of excellence. During the break between rounds, I continued my prep work while listening to the kitchen conversations around me. Dominic gathered his team near the walk-in cooler and gave them instructions for round 2. He emphasized that Michelin inspectors could arrive anytime and everyone needed to perform flawlessly. He said their 3rd star depended on showing that Étoile Noire had the culture and capabilities of elite establishments. The irony was so thick I nearly laughed out loud. Vincent asked what they should do about the volunteer causing problems at the prep station. I froze, wondering what I'd done to draw attention beyond existing in their space. Dominic glanced at me and said I wasn't worth worrying about, that volunteers were basically kitchen furniture that occasionally needed directing. Marguerite added that at least I was keeping my head down after she'd corrected my sloppiness earlier. Sophie didn't say anything, but I caught her looking at me with something between sympathy and recognition. She'd been treated the same way by these people, dismissed and diminished despite clearly having talent. The kitchen culture at Étoile Noire was toxic in ways that went beyond simple rudeness. This was systematic devaluation of anyone Dominic and his inner circle considered inferior. That culture would never earn a 3rd Michelin star, regardless of how perfectly he could prepare duck breast. Round 2 required teams to create a complete 3-course meal in 90 minutes. Dominic's menu featured seared scallops with cauliflower puree, short rib with root vegetables, and a deconstructed lemon tart. The ambition was appropriate for someone chasing Michelin recognition. I watched his team execute with precision that spoke to hours of practice, but the dynamics remained poisonous. Dominic screamed at Sophie when her scallop sear was 30 seconds off his specification. He called her incompetent and said she was embarrassing the restaurant in front of important judges. Sophie's hands shook as she refired the scallops. Vincent mocked her anxiety, asking Dominic how they'd ended up with such weak staff members. Marguerite focused on her dessert work, but didn't defend Sophie or suggest the men ease up. The silent complicity was its own form of cruelty. I memorized everything, knowing this evaluation would require extensive documentation. The food Dominic's team produced was genuinely excellent. Raymond Fontaine praised the scallop's perfect texture and the short ribs' tenderness. But Michelin stars weren't awarded to restaurants where talented cooks got berated and humiliated. The guide's criteria explicitly included workplace environment and leadership qualities. Dominic was showcasing the exact opposite of what Michelin valued. Between rounds, I asked Sophie if she could show me the proper way to brunoise the celery I'd been assigned. It was a deliberately basic question designed to seem appropriately humble for someone relegated to prep work. Sophie hesitated, glancing toward where Dominic stood talking with other chefs. She explained the technique quickly and quietly, keeping her voice low so the men wouldn't notice her helping the volunteer. I thanked her and asked how long she'd worked at Étoile Noire. She said 3 years, starting as a line cook and working up to her current position despite Dominic's management style. I asked carefully what she meant by that. Sophie looked at me directly and said Dominic only valued male cooks, that women had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. She'd watched 5 female cooks quit in the past 18 months because they couldn't handle the hostile environment. Sophie stayed because she needed the experience on her resume, and because leaving a Michelin-starred restaurant looked like failure. I told her she seemed incredibly skilled based on what I'd observed. Sophie laughed bitterly and said skill didn't matter when your head chef thought you were decoration. Before I could respond, Vincent called Sophie back to the line, telling her break time was over and they had a competition to win. Sophie hurried away and I returned to my celery, adding her testimony to my mental documentation. The final competition round required teams to prepare their restaurant's signature dish, the item that best represented their establishment's identity and excellence. Dominic chose Étoile Noire's butter-poached lobster with tarragon cream and compressed cucumber. The dish had been featured in 3 national magazines and was reportedly what convinced Michelin to consider them for a 3rd star. I'd actually tried this exact dish 6 months ago during my first anonymous visit to Étoile Noire. The preparation was flawless then, showcasing technical mastery and refined flavors. But that meal had been prepared under normal circumstances, not competition pressure. Today I was watching how Dominic's team functioned under stress, and the results were revealing. Dominic grabbed the lobster from Sophie's station and told her she'd overcooked it by 15 seconds, that she'd ruined their signature dish and probably cost them the competition. Sophie protested that she'd followed his exact timing specifications. Dominic said specifications were meaningless if she couldn't execute properly, that this was why women struggled in professional kitchens. The casual sexism was breathtaking in its openness. Vincent and Marguerite said nothing while Dominic berated Sophie for another 2 minutes. Then he refired the lobster himself, working with obvious skill while continuing to criticize Sophie's supposed incompetence. The new lobster was identical to the first, maybe even slightly less perfectly cooked, but Dominic declared it acceptable and moved forward with plating. Raymond Fontaine judged the final round with 2 guest judges from food magazines. They awarded Dominic's team first place, praising the lobster's butter-poached perfection and the tarragon cream's delicate flavoring. Dominic accepted the $50,000 prize check and gave a speech about Étoile Noire's commitment to culinary excellence and team collaboration. He thanked his staff by name, including Sophie, acting as if he hadn't spent the entire competition undermining her. The other chefs congratulated him, and several mentioned that Michelin would surely be impressed when their inspectors arrived. Dominic smiled and said he was confident Étoile Noire demonstrated the culture and capabilities Michelin valued. I stood at my prep station watching this performance, still wearing my volunteer coat and glasses. Nobody looked at me during the celebration. I was kitchen furniture, invisible unless I made a mistake worth correcting. Dominic caught my eye briefly and made a dismissive gesture, indicating I should start cleaning up the prep area since the competition had concluded. I nodded obediently and began gathering the vegetable scraps. Vincent walked past and told me to make sure everything was spotless before I left. He said volunteers needed to earn their way into professional kitchens by proving they could handle basic tasks. I assured him I'd clean thoroughly and thanked him for the opportunity to observe such skilled chefs. The gratitude seemed appropriate for my cover story. I finished cleaning the prep station 90 minutes later while the kitchen staff celebrated in the dining room. Bottles of champagne appeared and Dominic made several more toasts about Étoile Noire's excellence. I removed my volunteer coat, tucked it neatly on a hook, and left through the back entrance. My car was parked 3 blocks away and I sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes reviewing my detailed mental notes. Tomorrow I would begin writing the formal evaluation report that would determine Étoile Noire's Michelin status. Tonight I just needed to process what I'd witnessed. The culinary skill was undeniable. Dominic's technical abilities were among the best I'd evaluated this year, but technical skill was only one criterion among many. Michelin considered the complete dining experience, which included how restaurants treated their staff and whether leadership exemplified the values the guide wished to promote. Dominic had failed catastrophically on those measures. His kitchen culture was toxic, his treatment of female staff was discriminatory, and his leadership style relied on humiliation rather than mentorship. None of that aligned with Michelin's standards. I started my car and drove home, already composing the opening paragraph of my report in my head. Dominic thought he'd impressed the judges that mattered. He had no idea he'd been performing for the only judge whose opinion would determine his future. My report took 3 days to write and required 32 pages to document everything I'd observed. The Michelin evaluation protocol demanded specific evidence for every assessment, so I detailed the timeline of Dominic's interactions with Sophie, Vincent's complicity in the hostile environment, and Marguerite's silent enabling. I described the competition performance and the undeniable technical excellence Dominic's team demonstrated. But I also explained why that excellence couldn't outweigh the systematic workplace failures I'd witnessed. The guide's standards were explicit about this. Restaurants pursuing Michelin recognition needed to demonstrate exemplary leadership, positive workplace culture, and treatment of staff that reflected the establishment's claimed values. Étoile Noire failed on all 3 measures. My recommendation was unambiguous: deny the 3rd star and place the restaurant under review for potential removal of their existing 2 stars. This wasn't a decision I made lightly. Removing stars could destroy a restaurant's reputation and financial stability, but Michelin's credibility depended on maintaining standards that went beyond food quality. Dominic's behavior during the competition had revealed a pattern that likely existed throughout Étoile Noire's operation. I attached my volunteer experience as supplementary evidence, noting that unannounced observations often revealed truths that formal inspections missed. My supervisor Claudette reviewed the report and called me 2 days later, asking if I was certain about the severity of my recommendations. I confirmed everything and offered to provide additional documentation if needed. Claudette scheduled a formal review meeting for the following week. She invited Dominic to Michelin's regional office under the pretense of discussing his 3rd star application. Dominic arrived wearing an expensive suit and bringing Vincent as support. They both looked confident, expecting good news. Claudette began by thanking them for hosting the cooking competition and noting that Michelin representatives had been present to observe. Dominic's face lit up and he started to thank her for the recognition. Claudette interrupted and said the observations had raised significant concerns about Étoile Noire's workplace culture and leadership practices. Dominic's expression shifted to confusion. He asked what concerns could possibly exist given their competition performance and culinary excellence. Claudette explained that a Michelin inspector had observed the competition incognito and documented numerous incidents of discriminatory behavior, hostile workplace practices, and leadership failures. Dominic insisted there must be some mistake, that his kitchen operated with the highest professional standards. Claudette asked if he recalled the female volunteer assigned to prep station duty during the competition. Dominic said vaguely that yes, there had been some volunteers helping with basic tasks. Claudette opened my report and read several specific quotes from Dominic and Vincent, their exact words about women in professional kitchens and volunteers knowing their place. The color drained from Dominic's face as he realized what had happened. Vincent started to protest that their comments had been taken out of context, that kitchen environments were inherently intense and some banter was normal. Claudette cut him off and said there was no context that justified the documented behavior. She read additional sections detailing how Sophie had been treated, including the incident where Dominic grabbed my wrist and the numerous instances of gendered criticism. Dominic asked who the inspector was, and Claudette said that information was confidential, but the inspector's credentials and observations were beyond dispute. She explained that Michelin's evaluation criteria explicitly included workplace culture and that Étoile Noire had demonstrated a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the guide's values. Dominic's shock was turning to anger. He said one inspector's subjective interpretation shouldn't outweigh years of culinary excellence and their existing 2-star rating. Claudette responded that the observations weren't subjective. They were documented facts with specific quotes and timestamps. She added that Michelin took workplace discrimination extremely seriously, and that Dominic's behavior during the competition suggested systemic problems throughout his operation. Vincent tried to argue that the competition environment was artificially stressful and didn't reflect their normal kitchen culture. Claudette asked if that meant their normal culture was better or worse than what the inspector observed. Vincent didn't answer. The meeting lasted another 30 minutes while Dominic tried various arguments and justifications. None of them changed the outcome. Claudette delivered the formal decision at the end of the meeting. Étoile Noire's application for a 3rd star was denied. Additionally, their existing 2-star rating was suspended pending a comprehensive review of their workplace practices and kitchen culture. Dominic would need to demonstrate significant documented changes before Michelin would consider reinstating their stars or evaluating them for additional recognition. The suspension would be announced in the next guide update, which meant Étoile Noire would lose their Michelin distinction in approximately 6 weeks. Dominic asked what specific changes were required, and Claudette provided a detailed list. Mandatory workplace culture training for all staff. Implementation of formal harassment and discrimination policies. Third-party workplace audits conducted quarterly. Evidence of improved staff retention, particularly among female employees. Written commitments from Dominic about leadership practices and accountability. The requirements were extensive and deliberate. Michelin wanted to ensure any changes were real and lasting, not performative responses to avoid consequences. Dominic's face had gone from shocked to pale to red throughout the meeting. He asked if they could appeal the decision, and Claudette said yes. The appeals process was outlined in the documentation she was providing. But she added that appeals rarely succeeded when supported by inspector reports as detailed as the one Étoile Noire had generated. Dominic and Vincent left the office looking destroyed. Their confidence from the competition had evaporated completely. The news broke publicly 2 days later when the restaurant industry newsletter reported that Étoile Noire's Michelin stars were suspended pending review. The article didn't include specific reasons, but restaurant insiders speculated immediately. Suspended stars were rare and usually indicated serious problems beyond food quality. Food bloggers and industry commentators started investigating, and within a week, multiple former Étoile Noire employees came forward with stories about hostile workplace conditions. 3 women described experiences nearly identical to what I'd observed with Sophie. They detailed Dominic's pattern of berating female staff, Vincent's enabling behavior, and the toxic culture that drove talented cooks away. One former employee said she'd filed a complaint with the restaurant ownership, but was told that Dominic's results justified his management style. Another said she'd been told directly that professional kitchens weren't appropriate for women who couldn't handle pressure. The testimonies painted a picture of systematic dysfunction that went far beyond one bad day during a competition. Dominic tried to control the narrative by releasing a statement saying he was committed to workplace excellence and was implementing improvements to address Michelin's concerns. But the damage was done. Several prominent chefs publicly criticized Dominic's leadership. Food writers questioned how Étoile Noire had maintained their stars while operating such a hostile environment. Reservations dropped significantly as diners chose to support restaurants with better workplace reputations. Sophie reached out to me 6 weeks after the Michelin suspension was announced. She'd gotten my contact information from Claudette after asking if there was any way to thank the inspector who documented what happened during the competition. I agreed to meet her for coffee at a small cafe far from Étoile Noire. Sophie arrived looking nervous but determined. She told me she'd quit the restaurant 2 weeks after the Michelin decision was announced. Dominic had tried to blame the suspension on her performance during the competition, suggesting that if she'd executed properly, they would have impressed the inspector. Sophie realized then that nothing would change fundamentally at Étoile Noire, regardless of what policies Dominic implemented. She was now working at a smaller restaurant with a female head chef, and said the difference in culture was astonishing. People treated each other with respect. Mistakes were learning opportunities rather than reasons for humiliation, and she was developing her skills faster than she had in 3 years at Étoile Noire. Sophie said she wanted to thank me for seeing what was happening and taking it seriously. She'd felt invisible for so long, dismissed and devalued, that having someone with authority validate her experience meant everything. I told her she wasn't invisible. She was talented and deserving of better treatment than Dominic had provided. We talked for 2 hours about kitchen culture and the changes needed across the restaurant industry. 4 months after the suspension, Étoile Noire closed permanently. Dominic announced the closure in a statement blaming the Michelin decision for destroying the restaurant's reputation and financial viability. He maintained that his kitchen practices had been appropriate, and that one inspector's subjective evaluation had unfairly ended his career. The statement generated immediate backlash from former employees and industry observers who pointed out that numerous people had corroborated the hostile workplace culture. Vincent found work at another restaurant but was let go within 3 months after staff complained about his behavior. Marguerite opened a small pastry shop and seemed to be doing well, though she never publicly addressed her role in Étoile Noire's toxic environment. Dominic attempted to open a new restaurant under a different name but couldn't secure investors after his workplace reputation became widely known. Last I heard, he was working as a private chef for wealthy clients, still technically employing his culinary skills, but without the platform or prestige he'd previously enjoyed. The fall was comprehensive and permanent. Dominic had assumed technical excellence would outweigh everything else, that judges would overlook how he treated people as long as his food impressed them. He'd learned the hard way that Michelin standards were more holistic than he'd understood. Sophie became an advocate for improving restaurant workplace culture. She started speaking at culinary schools about the realities of professional kitchens and the need for better labor practices. She partnered with a nonprofit organization that worked to address harassment and discrimination in food service. Her public presence grew as she shared her story and connected with other workers who'd experienced similar treatment. Sophie mentioned in one interview that her wake-up call had come during a cooking competition when she watched someone she assumed was just a volunteer prep worker, quietly observing everything with careful attention. She said she'd recognized something in how I worked that suggested I saw more than I was letting on. That observation had given her hope that maybe someone with authority would actually care about what was happening. 6 months after Étoile Noire closed, Sophie competed in a nationally televised cooking competition and won her category. During her winner interview, she talked about leaving toxic workplace environments and finding kitchens that valued people alongside culinary excellence. The exposure launched her career in new directions. 2 restaurants reached out offering head chef positions. A cookbook publisher contacted her about writing a memoir focused on her experiences. Sophie was building something meaningful from the wreckage of Étoile Noire. I continued my work as a Michelin inspector, conducting evaluations across North America, and maintaining the anonymity that made honest observations possible. The Étoile Noire case became something of a legend within Michelin's inspection program, used in training as an example of how unannounced observations could reveal truths that formal evaluations missed. Claudette told new inspectors about the time one of our team had worked an entire competition as a prep volunteer to observe a kitchen's real culture. The story emphasized that technical excellence alone would never qualify a restaurant for Michelin recognition if the workplace environment failed to meet standards. Some inspectors asked if I'd felt unsafe during the competition, particularly when Dominic grabbed my wrist or when the staff's dismissive treatment escalated. I admitted there had been moments of discomfort, but that the observations I gathered were worth the temporary unpleasantness. My job required understanding restaurants completely, not just sampling their best dishes during carefully managed inspections. Sometimes that meant experiencing how they treated people they thought didn't matter. The insights gained from those experiences informed evaluations in ways that conventional inspections never could. 2 years after the Étoile Noire incident, I was conducting evaluations in another city when I walked into a restaurant for a scheduled anonymous dinner. The owner greeted me at the door and led me to my table. Halfway through the main course, I recognized the sous chef working the line through the open kitchen window. It was Vincent. He'd clearly found new employment despite his role in Étoile Noire's toxic culture. I finished my meal and completed the evaluation, which was generally positive about the food quality and service, but I included specific observations about the sous chef's interactions with other staff members. Vincent had called a female line cook incompetent when she questioned his plating instruction. He'd dismissed another staff member's suggestion about seasoning adjustment without consideration. The patterns from Étoile Noire were repeating in this new environment. My report noted these concerns and recommended the restaurant implement workplace culture monitoring to ensure leadership practices aligned with Michelin standards. The restaurant didn't receive stars in that evaluation cycle. 3 months later, I learned Vincent had been let go after multiple staff complaints about his behavior. Some people never learned that technical skills couldn't compensate for treating others badly. Vincent had watched Étoile Noire collapse due to workplace culture failures, and apparently concluded the problem was bad luck rather than fundamental leadership flaws. His continued unemployment and damaged reputation suggested the industry was slowly recognizing that tolerating toxic behavior had real costs. The broader industry changes happened gradually but unmistakably. More restaurants implemented formal workplace policies. Culinary schools started teaching professional conduct alongside cooking techniques. Industry publications ran articles about toxic kitchen culture and featured chefs who were building positive work environments. The conversation shifted from accepting harassment and discrimination as normal kitchen intensity to recognizing those behaviors as unacceptable regardless of culinary results. Change was slow and incomplete, but the direction was clear. Étoile Noire's collapse had sent a message that reputational destruction could happen to any establishment, regardless of previous prestige. Several prominent chefs publicly acknowledged past workplace failures and committed to improvement. Some of these commitments seemed genuine while others appeared performative, but even performative improvement created better conditions for workers than outright hostility. The Michelin Guide explicitly highlighted workplace culture in several evaluation announcements, making clear that stars could be lost for reasons beyond food quality. These signals influenced how restaurants operated and how chefs approached leadership. Nobody wanted to be the next cautionary tale about losing recognition due to workplace failures. Sophie's career continued flourishing. She opened her own restaurant 3 years after leaving Étoile Noire, a small, intimate space that seated 30 people and featured her personal culinary vision. The restaurant emphasized seasonal ingredients and technique-driven preparations. But equally important, Sophie built a kitchen culture based on respect, mentorship, and collaborative excellence. She hired staff from diverse backgrounds and created an environment where people could develop their skills without fear of humiliation. The restaurant earned critical acclaim within 6 months. Food writers praised Sophie's technical abilities and creative approach. Industry observers noted the positive workplace culture and suggested it contributed to the consistency and quality of the dining experience. 12 months after opening, Sophie's restaurant received 2 Michelin stars. She was the youngest female chef in the region to achieve that recognition. During her celebration interview, Sophie credited the path that had led through Étoile Noire and the competition where someone she'd thought was just a volunteer had actually been paying very careful attention to everything happening in that kitchen. She said that experience taught her that people always noticed more than you assumed, that how you treated others mattered as much as how you cooked, and that building something excellent required more than technical skill. I attended Sophie's restaurant anonymously 6 months after she'd received her stars, conducting a follow-up evaluation to assess whether the initial recognition remained warranted. The meal was extraordinary. Sophie had developed her style significantly since her time as Dominic's line cook. Her flavors were bold and precisely balanced. Her techniques showcased years of experience combined with creative innovation. But beyond the food quality, I observed the kitchen dynamics through the open pass. Sophie directed her staff with clarity and respect. When a line cook made a timing error, Sophie corrected it calmly and used the moment to teach proper technique. When her sous chef suggested an adjustment to a sauce, Sophie listened, tasted, and implemented the improvement while crediting the suggestion publicly. The kitchen operated with intensity appropriate to a Michelin-starred establishment, but without toxicity or fear. Staff members communicated efficiently and supported each other. The contrast with Étoile Noire couldn't have been starker. After the meal, I completed my evaluation report with a strong recommendation that Sophie's stars be maintained and that she be considered for a third star when her restaurant reached the minimum operational timeline Michelin required. The recommendation noted specifically that her kitchen culture exemplified the values Michelin wished to promote in the restaurant industry. 5 years after the Étoile Noire competition, I was promoted to senior inspector and given additional responsibilities training new evaluators. One of my first training sessions focused on comprehensive evaluation methodology. I used the Étoile Noire case as an example, walking new inspectors through how I'd positioned myself as a volunteer to observe authentic kitchen culture. Several trainees asked if I'd felt guilty about the deception involved in going undercover. I explained that Michelin inspections were always conducted with some degree of anonymity, that honest evaluation required restaurants not to know they were being assessed. The volunteer position was simply an extension of that methodology, allowing me to see how staff behaved when they thought nobody important was watching. One trainee asked if I'd been surprised by how openly hostile Dominic and Vincent had been, whether I'd expected them to hide problematic behaviors better. I said the competition pressure had probably lowered their inhibitions, but I suspected the behaviors I observed were standard practice at Étoile Noire. Follow-up conversations with former employees had confirmed that assessment. Another trainee asked about the ethical considerations of letting the competition proceed without intervening when I witnessed discriminatory treatment. I acknowledged that question deserved serious thought, but explained that my role was evaluation rather than intervention, and that documenting the full pattern of behavior served the long-term goal of systemic improvement, better than stopping individual incidents. The restaurant industry continued evolving in directions that suggested the Étoile Noire case had contributed to broader cultural shifts. Several celebrity chefs faced consequences for workplace behavior that previously would have been tolerated or dismissed as passionate intensity. Restaurant workers organized advocacy groups pushing for better labor conditions. Media coverage increasingly highlighted workplace culture alongside food quality when reviewing restaurants. Michelin wasn't the only organization considering these factors, though their influence remained significant. The James Beard Foundation revised their award criteria to include workplace culture assessment. Other restaurant guides implemented similar policies. The collective message to the industry was clear: culinary excellence alone wouldn't earn or maintain elite recognition anymore. Dominic had become a cautionary tale, his name invoked in discussions about chefs whose toxic leadership undermined their technical talents. Some industry observers argued the focus on workplace culture had gone too far, that kitchens required intensity and hierarchy to function at the highest levels. But those arguments increasingly fell flat as examples like Sophie's restaurant demonstrated that excellence and positive culture weren't mutually exclusive. You could build extraordinary kitchens without cruelty. You could demand technical precision without discrimination. The old excuses were dying. I never publicly revealed my identity as the inspector who'd evaluated Étoile Noire. Maintaining anonymity was crucial for my continued effectiveness in conducting honest evaluations. But within Michelin's organization and among restaurant industry leaders who worked closely with the guide, my reputation grew significantly. Chefs and restaurant owners knew that inspectors might be observing them in unexpected contexts, that the person at the prep station or the quiet diner in the corner booth might be evaluating everything they did. This awareness changed behavior in restaurants pursuing or maintaining Michelin recognition. They couldn't perform excellence only during scheduled inspections anymore because they never knew when evaluation was happening. The paranoia some chefs felt about this uncertainty was perhaps unfortunate, but it also meant they had to maintain consistent standards rather than creating temporary showcases for inspectors. The methodology I'd developed during the Étoile Noire evaluation became standard practice across Michelin's inspection program. Inspectors regularly took positions as volunteers, temporary workers, or anonymous diners in ways that allowed extensive observation beyond single-meal evaluations. The guide's reputation for rigor and thoroughness grew as stories circulated about these comprehensive assessment methods. Sophie called me 3 years after she'd received her 2 stars with news that Michelin was considering her restaurant for a 3rd star. She was obviously excited but also nervous about the evaluation process. I congratulated her and said I was confident her restaurant deserved the recognition based on everything I'd observed during my follow-up visit. Sophie asked if I'd be the inspector conducting the final evaluation, and I explained that conflict of interest protocols prevented me from evaluating restaurants where I had personal relationships with ownership. Another inspector would conduct her assessment and make the final recommendation. Sophie said she understood and thanked me for everything I'd done, not just the Étoile Noire documentation, but also the example I'd set about taking workplace culture seriously. She said the industry needed more people in positions of authority who recognized that how people were treated mattered as much as what food they produced. 2 months later, Sophie's restaurant received its 3rd star. She became the youngest female chef in North America with that recognition. Her achievement was covered extensively by food media and celebrated as a milestone for women in professional kitchens. During her press interviews, Sophie consistently emphasized that her success was built on creating a kitchen where everyone could excel, that toxic culture wasn't necessary for greatness, and that the industry's old guard needed to evolve or become irrelevant. Dominic attempted a comeback 6 years after Étoile Noire closed. He'd apparently spent time in Europe working in several restaurants and claimed he'd learned from his past mistakes. He partnered with investors to open a new restaurant in a different city, positioning the venture as evidence of redemption and growth. The restaurant's publicity emphasized Dominic's renewed commitment to workplace excellence alongside culinary mastery. Food media covered the opening with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Some writers argued everyone deserved second chances and that Dominic's technical skills warranted another opportunity. Others questioned whether someone with his documented history of toxic behavior could genuinely change, or if this was just better public relations. I was not assigned to evaluate Dominic's new restaurant, but another inspector was. That inspector's report noted that while Dominic's food quality remained exceptional, his interactions with staff still showed problematic patterns. He was more careful about what he said in front of dining room guests, but kitchen observations revealed similar dismissive treatment of junior staff and gendered criticism of female cooks. The inspector documented several incidents nearly identical to what I'd witnessed at Étoile Noire. The new restaurant received 1 star in their first evaluation, a decent achievement but far below Dominic's previous recognition. The inspector's report made clear that advancement to 2 or 3 stars would require demonstrated workplace culture improvements beyond superficial policy implementations. Dominic's second act was not failing spectacularly, but it wasn't succeeding in the ways he'd obviously hoped. His reputation remained permanently marked by the Étoile Noire collapse. 10 years after the cooking competition, I was invited to speak at a culinary conference about evaluation methodology and industry standards. The audience included chefs, restaurant owners, and culinary students. I discussed Michelin's evaluation criteria and emphasized how workplace culture had become equally important to food quality in determining recognition. During the question period, someone asked directly about the Étoile Noire case and whether I'd been the inspector involved. I acknowledged my role while maintaining that specific details remained confidential per Michelin's protocols. The questioner asked if I'd felt any guilt about the restaurant's closure and the careers that were damaged by my evaluation. I took a moment before responding, wanting to address the question thoughtfully rather than defensively. I explained that my evaluation hadn't destroyed Étoile Noire. Dominic's behavior and leadership failures had created the conditions for collapse. My role was documenting those failures accurately. If exposing truth caused consequences, the responsibility belonged to those who'd created the situation requiring exposure. The restaurant industry needed to understand that workplace culture wasn't peripheral to excellence but central to it. Toxic environments produced traumatized workers, high turnover, and ultimately unsustainable operations regardless of technical achievements. Étoile Noire's closure was a natural consequence of fundamental business failures disguised as passionate intensity. My evaluation had simply accelerated the timeline of an inevitable outcome. The audience applauded that response, and several people approached me afterward to share their own experiences with workplace toxicity in kitchens. The conversations reinforced that Étoile Noire wasn't unique, just unusually well documented. Sophie attended that same conference, and we met for dinner afterward. She'd built her single restaurant into a small restaurant group, 3 locations that maintained her standards for both food quality and workplace culture. Each restaurant had earned Michelin recognition and developed strong reputations for treating staff well. Sophie had become an industry leader not just in culinary terms, but in demonstrating alternative management approaches. She told me that several of her current staff members were former Étoile Noire employees who'd left that kitchen traumatized but found healing and growth in her restaurants. 2 had become sous chefs at her locations. One was developing his own restaurant concept with Sophie's mentorship and investment. The transformation of careers that had nearly been destroyed by Dominic's toxicity was deeply satisfying. Sophie said she thought often about that competition day when she'd been yelled at repeatedly for performance that was actually excellent, when she'd felt invisible and worthless, when she'd noticed me at the prep station watching everything with careful attention. She said she'd wondered at the time if anyone with power would ever care about what happened in kitchens like Étoile Noire's. Having someone care enough to document an act had changed not just her career trajectory, but her entire understanding of what was possible in the restaurant industry. Sophie asked if I ever regretted how things had played out, if I thought the industry's response had been proportionate to what happened. I told her I had no regrets and believed the response was appropriate given the systemic nature of the problems we'd exposed. The restaurant industry still has significant workplace culture problems. Change happens slowly in traditional establishments and toxic behavior persists in many kitchens. But the conversation has shifted fundamentally from my early years as an inspector. Workplace culture is now discussed openly as a factor in restaurant success. Young chefs are learning that leadership requires more than technical skill. Workers have more resources for reporting harassment and discrimination. Media coverage holds celebrity chefs accountable for their treatment of staff in ways that weren't common 15 years ago. Michelin's evaluation criteria explicitly include workplace factors, and other guides have followed suit. These changes aren't complete or perfect, but they represent genuine progress toward an industry where talent can flourish without requiring people to endure abuse. The Étoile Noire case contributed to this shift by demonstrating that consequences could be severe for even prestigious establishments. Dominic had assumed his Michelin stars and competition victories would protect him from accountability. He'd learned that assumption was catastrophically wrong. Other chefs observed his fall and recalibrated their own risk calculations. Some changed behavior out of genuine growth, while others simply recognized that workplace toxicity had become a business liability. Either way, workers benefited from the improved conditions. 15 years after I worked that prep station at Étoile Noire's cooking competition, I retired from Michelin's inspection program. My career had spanned thousands of restaurant evaluations across North America and established me as one of the organization's most respected senior inspectors. The methodology I developed for comprehensive observation, including the strategic use of cover identities to see authentic kitchen culture, had become standard practice across the guide's operations. My successor as regional senior inspector was an accomplished evaluator who'd been mentored through several cases and understood the importance of holistic assessment. On my last day, Claudette hosted a small retirement gathering where several inspectors shared stories about evaluations that had challenged or changed them. Multiple people referenced the Étoile Noire case as formative in understanding that their role extended beyond judging food quality to evaluating whether restaurants deserved the platform and prestige Michelin recognition provided. Sophie sent a message thanking me again for seeing what was happening that day and taking it seriously enough to document and act. She said her career and the careers of everyone working in her restaurants had been shaped by my willingness to look beyond technical excellence. That message meant more to me than any professional recognition I'd received. The work had always been about maintaining standards that reflected genuine excellence in all its dimensions. If I'd contributed to an industry where talent could flourish without cruelty, where workplace culture mattered alongside culinary skill, then my career had fulfilled its purpose. Dominic had treated me as invisible kitchen furniture that day at the prep station, dismissing me because he saw only a volunteer rather than someone evaluating his entire operation. His blindness to what was actually happening had cost him everything he'd worked to build. Sometimes the people you dismiss are exactly the ones paying closest attention. Sometimes the judgment you fear has already happened and the consequences are just waiting to arrive. Sometimes excellent food isn't enough if you're terrible at treating humans with basic dignity. Those lessons had cost Dominic his career, but they'd taught the industry something valuable about the real standards of excellence. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.